Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 19th installment of my Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links Best Decks series. Today I'm going to be showing you a deck called Swift Gaia Storm. So just that you guys know, this deck is based around the Rank 1 NA from the World Championship qualifier. So if you want more information about this deck, or you want another take on this deck, probably a better one to be honest, go check out Decklist. His YouTube channel is Duel Links Meta. As pretty much this video will be around my version of the deck and not his. I've only changed a few cards slightly because his deck is based around kind of more of a tournament format, so it's got cards that counter other decks in particular, which I'll go through later on, so it's not really necessary in just a general manner. But anyway, I'll get to get on with the video. Alright, so the best character for this deck is literally anyone, as the best skill is a universal skill and can be obtained by any character in the game. The best skill is Balance. Your starting hand will reflect the card balance of your deck. This skill is very important for the deck as it makes sure your starting hand will only contain one monster and the rest will be 3 spells/traps. Later on when I go through the strategy of the deck, I'll talk about why this is important in particular for this deck, but for now, just so you know, the best way this deck starts is 1 monster card and 3 spells/traps. Alright, now I'll go through the deck list. The deck list I run is 1 Swift Gaia, 1 Diskblade Rider, 3 Flash Assailant, 3 Gateway to Chaos, 1 Enemy Controller, 3 Storm, 1 Smoke Grenade of the Thief, 3 Dimension Gates, 3 Wild Tornadoes, and 1 Windstorm of Etaqua. So the main difference between my deck and Deckade's version of the deck is I run Diskblade Rider over his Gearfried, as I'm pretty sure his Gearfried is only in the deck because it was there to counter Weevil decks during the tournament, and when you're just normally laddering, you don't often find a Weevil that often, at least I don't anyway. So I took it out and replaced it with a Diskblade Rider, which I'll talk about later on when I go through each of the cards individually, why this card's kind of got some synergy with the deck, as opposed to Gearfried, which doesn't really synergize that well, except with maybe Smoke Grenade of the Thief, which Decade didn't even run in his deck anyway. The second major difference you'll probably notice is I only have 1 enemy controller and he had 3. This is because, 1, I really like this card Windstorm of Etaqua and I think it should just be in the deck anyway. And 2, I find enemy controller pretty boring of a card and no fun to use. So I took 2 of them out and replaced 1 with a Smoke Grenade of the Thief and a Windstorm of Etaqua. But as I said at the start of the video, if you want to check out his deck list, go ahead, feel free. His is probably better as he came first in the World Championship qualifier obviously, so he's probably a bit better at the game than I am. Okay, so now I'll go through the strategy in this deck. The strategy in this deck kind of varies from game to game. It's the same general strategy, but it's kind of a little bit different depending on how the game goes and whether or not you're going first or going second. So the main aim of this deck is to have 0 cards in hand, so you can then summon your 0 cost in hand monsters, which are Swift Gaia and Flash Assailant. Both of these cards rely on you having 0 cards in your hand for them to gain their buff. In Swift Gaia's case, it's if you have no cards in your hand, you can special summon it with no tributing cost. And in Flash Assailant's case, you can summon it and it will have, obviously, its attack won't be decreased. So the way you do this is, just like I said at the start, you have the skill Balance, which allows you to have just the 1 monster card and only spells and traps. Therefore you can set your spells and traps and you'll have 0 cards in hand except the 1 monster card, which you can then summon. So this is where it gets a little bit more tricky for me to explain. The main way you keep your Swift Gaia alive or your Flash Assailant alive is you'll use the card Storm to destroy your opponent's back row. What the card Storm does is it destroys all of your spells and trap cards that you have set, and it will destroy the same amount of your opponent's spell/trap cards. So depending on if you go first or if you go second, you'll choose whether or not you're going to use Storm on the turn you play your monster. Normally if you're going second, you're going to want to use Storm on that turn, but if you're going first, Obviously your opponent won't have any set spells and traps, so you're not going to want to use the Storm card. The main target for your Storm card is going to be Wild Tornado, as when you destroy Wild Tornado, it allows you to target one of your opponent's face-up cards and destroy it. So therefore, if you go second, you can activate the card Storm, kill off any Wild Tornadoes you have and any other set spells and traps you have, destroy one of their face-up cards, and destroy the rest of their spells. Therefore, leaving their board completely open for you to play your Flash Assailant and your Swift Gaia the Fierce Knights to just attack their life points without them being destroyed, without them being enemy controlled, without them being ordered to charge, just being completely safe. Don't worry if you don't completely understand the strategy yet. At the end of the video I will have gameplay of this deck, which will completely the deck isn't that hard to play, it's just hard for me to explain. It will show you completely how this deck is played and how it's run. One more part of the strategy that I'd just like to talk about is the Swift Gaia part. So Swift Gaia is kind of a key component of this deck, and it's really easy for you to get Swift Gaia to your hand by using Gateway to Chaos. What Gateway to Chaos does is basically it just takes Swift Gaia the Fierce Knight and adds it to your hand. The rest of the card text is completely irrelevant for this deck and means nothing. So this is where it gets a little bit harder to explain again. Sometimes you want to use Gateway to Chaos with Storm, sometimes you don't. Most of the time, Gateway to Chaos, what you want to do with it is you want to set the card and use it the turn afterwards. This is because you want to play your Flash Assailants and you want to have 0 cards in your hand. If you use Gateway to Chaos on the exact same turn you play your Flash Assailant, you're not going to be able to play your Gaia. So therefore your Flash Assailant its defect will activate and you'll lose 400 attack and 400 defense. So normally you want to use Gateway to Chaos the turn after you've played your Flash Assailants. So if you're going second, for example, and you want to use your Storm card to wipe their backline, you're not going to want to use Gateway to Chaos in that destruction if you've got a Flash Assailant in your hand, as you're going to want to be able to use the Gateway to Chaos to get your Swift Gaia and not have any cards in your hand at the end of the turn you're currently on. So, bit hard for me to explain. There will be gameplay at the end that will showcase Swift Gaia, so don't worry about that. Just make sure you work out what cards you do want to use with Storm and what cards you don't. It may take a little bit of practice to get used to, but it's really not that hard once you've kind of used the deck a little bit. And the final part of the strategy is at the very end of your turn, you're going to set any cards you have that are not being used with Storm, and most of them are going to be protection cards such as Dimension Gate, which will protect your monsters from being destroyed. As if your monsters are destroyed in this deck, you're practically boned, you're screwed, as you're only going to have at most 2 monster cards on the board at one time, most of the time, and if they both die, or if either of them die, you're kind of out of luck with as monster cards go, and you only run 5 of them in the deck, so it's unlikely you're going to draw more of them. So it's really important you keep your monster cards alive in this deck, which is why you run so many protection spells such as Dimension Gate and Enemy Controller. Alright, so that's basically it for the strategy of this deck. If you don't understand, don't worry, there's gameplay at the end that will showcase this deck in action. Now I'll go through each of the cards individually and why each of them are in the deck. Just so you know, if you don't plan to stick around for any more of this video, please stick around for the Dimension Gate part, or skip to the Dimension Gate part, as it kind of has a unique interaction with Wild Tornado I'll go through when I get to it. But for now, I'm going to go through the monster cards first. Alright, so the monster cards in this deck are Swift Gaia the Fierce Knight, Flash Assailant, and Diskblade Rider. The first 2 monster cards in this deck perform the exact same function, as they're both based around you having 0 cards in your hand. The main difference between these 2 cards is Swift Gaia cannot be used if you have a card in your hand, it just literally cannot be used. And Flash Assailant can still be played if you have cards in hand, but its attack and defense will be decreased by 400 for each card. This little bit of information becomes a lot more important when it comes to you going second, because when you go second, you'll find Sometimes your first draw of the game will be a monster card, which means you'll have 2 monster cards in your hand and you won't be able to play your Swift Gaia, and if you play your Flash Assailant, you'll be guaranteed to activate its effect and it will lose 400 attack and 400 defense, as you can't play 2 monster cards in the same turn. So that's the only time this deck has kind of trouble functioning, but it doesn't happen very often. Both of these cards are big damaging beaters, both have 2000 or more attack, and will be able to destroy any card your opponent plays on the first turn most of the time. And if they actually isn't able to destroy them, you'll most likely be able to destroy it with your Wild Tornadoes and your Storm combo anyway. So these will be able to attack your opponent's life points and do half of their life points in one turn. So most of the games involving this deck will end very, very quickly. The third monster card in this deck is kind of just there as a 5th monster, as you'd prefer to just have a second Swift Gaia or another Flash Assailant, but as that's not actually possible, you have to have just some random monster in the deck. In this case, I've chosen Diskblade Rider, as this card has some synergy with the deck and can perform in a similar way to the other 2 cards. What Diskblade Rider does is if you have a normal trap card in your graveyard, you can banish that target and Diskblade Rider will gain 500 attack until your opponent's end phase. So basically, after you've used the card Storm on your traps such as Wild Tornado or Windstorm of Etaqua, you can then use Diskblade Rider's effect to buff it and make it over 2000 attack, making it similar to the other 2 monster cards in the deck and perform the same role of being these big damage beating cards that will be able to destroy your opponent within a couple of turns. So this card isn't as good as the other 2 monsters, as it requires you to have done something beforehand, but it does perform the same role in a way. Alright, now I'll go through the spells and traps in the deck. The spells and traps in the deck are Gateway to Chaos, Storm, Wild Tornado, Smoke Grenade of the Thief, Dimension Gate, Enemy Controller, and Windstorm of Etaqua. Gateway to Chaos has a very specific use. All it does is it allows you to take Gaia from your deck and place it in your hand. And once it's done that, it becomes a completely useless card. The rest of its effect is completely irrelevant and has nothing to do with this deck. Basically, all Gateway to Chaos is another way of getting Gaia to your hand without just trying to draw it. The good thing about this card is once you've used it to get your Gaia to your hand, it becomes completely useless. So it can be a free target for you to use with Storm to destroy your opponent's backline of spells and trap cards. The next 3 spells/traps in this deck are the targets you're going to want to be using the most of the time when you use the card Storm. The next 3 spells and traps in this deck are Storm, Wild Tornado, and Smoke Grenade of the Thief. All 3 of these are fairly good targets for Storm, as the rest of your spells/traps in the deck are good for protecting your monsters, and you don't really want to use with Storm unless you have to. What Storm does is it allows you to destroy as many spells/trap cards you control as possible, then destroy as many spells/trap cards your opponent controls as possible, up to the number of cards destroyed by this effect. So destroying your opponent's back row, really easy with this card, and allowing your monsters to stay safe when you summon them. This is why Wild Tornado and Smoke Grenade the Thief really synergize well with Storm, as when either of them are destroyed by a card effect, they will destroy something else your opponent has. What Wild Tornado does is when it is destroyed, it will destroy a face-up card your opponent has, whether that be a monster, a spell, a trap, a field spell, doesn't matter, it will destroy it. What Smoke Grenade the Thief does is a little bit different. When it is destroyed, it allows you to look at your opponent's hand, which is really good in itself. Being able to look at your opponent's hand is really good for getting information and knowing what's coming up. But also, it allows you to pick a card from that and discard it to the graveyard, so it can destroy combo decks. Really strong card if you're able to get it off. Now, the benefit to Wild Tornado is it doesn't have to be used with Storm to still be useful. What Wild Tornado can also do is it can just be used to destroy any face-up spell or trap card your opponent controls. So keep in mind, Wild Tornado is a destruction effect, not a negate effect, so don't use it on a quick play card like Order to Charge or anything. Use it on cards like Mirror Wall and stuff like that. It does have a slight downside, as when it does do that effect and destroys one of your opponent's spells/traps, it allows them to set another trap card or spell card face down on the field, which doesn't really affect the deck that often, to be honest, as most of the time your opponent's going to have played all these spells and traps anyway, but sometimes it does come up as a negative effect. The last three cards in the deck are Dimension Gate, Enemy Controller, and Windstorm of Etaqua. All three of these are meant to be used after Storm. They can be used with Storm, but it's better to use them afterwards, as just ways of defending your monster and keeping it alive. Dimension Gate is probably the stronger one of these cards, as it can protect them from battle, it can protect it from any Order to the Charges or any spells/traps, and is generally just a much stronger card. What Dimension Gate does is allows you to activate it to target one monster you control, banish that target, and when your opponent declares a direct attack, you can destroy your Dimension Gate and special summon that monster back from the graveyard. So when your opponent tries to destroy your monster, you activate Dimension Gate and you banish it, therefore it becomes completely safe from anything your opponent does, and when you destroy your Dimension Gate, you can bring it back again. So there are three ways you can get your monster back once you've banished it. The first is your opponent deals a direct attack to you, as when he declares the attack, you can then activate Dimension Gate to send it to the graveyard and bring back your monster to shield your life points. The second is you can use your Storm on your Dimension Gate to destroy it, which will also allow you to bring your monster back from being banished. And the third way is by using your Wild Tornadoes on your Dimension Gate. So this is the unique interaction I wanted to talk about earlier. When you use Wild Tornado to destroy Dimension Gate, it can also allow you to use a monster to attack twice. I will have an example of this in the gameplay at the end of the video, but basically you can use your monster to attack your opponent, then you can activate your Dimension Gate, banish your monster, activate your Wild Tornado, destroy the Dimension Gate, bring back your monster, and attack again with it. This can give you kind of a quick one-turn kill, as well as allow you to get your opponent to use their spells and traps to try and stop your monster, and then still be able to attack with it afterwards. So it's kind of a cool, unique interaction that this deck has. The last two cards, Enemy Controller and Windstorm of Etaqua, as I say in all my videos, both provide the exact same role. Most of the time, you're just going to be using them to change your opponent's monsters when they attack you to defense position. Obviously, they both have their extra little buffs that makes them stronger in different situations, such as Windstorm of Etaqua allows you to change every single monster's battle position your opponent controls, therefore making none of his monsters be able to attack you in a single turn. And Enemy Controller has kind of some added flexibility to it, as it also allows you to have the ability to destroy one of your monsters and take control of one of your opponent's monsters. So sometimes you can take control of something like a Blue Eyes and just destroy your opponent in that turn using his card instead of your own. So it can sometimes be used to get around blockers and other specific situations that Windstorm of Etaqua will be useless in. Well, anyway guys, that's pretty much it for this deck guide. If you'd like to see gameplay for this deck in action, if you don't understand how it works just yet, end of the video I'll have 2 gameplays I believe. But anyway, that's pretty much it. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.
Duel. Duel!